Hey y'all, Chuck Gordon, thank you for joining me as we walk through God's Word. We've been talking about living in purpose. Today coming from Romans 12, 1 and 2, and I'm actually here on the Savannah River. You can see this fog bank rolling across the river here. It is so beautiful. But that said, Romans 12, 1 and 2, God's Word says this, a favorite passage. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And I love just again how Paul lays it out in Romans, just that if you and I want to know what God's will is, he's saying we've got to lay aside our lives as a living sacrifice to God, saying, God, I'm going to live for you regardless of what the circumstances are, regardless of what anybody else expects of me. I'm going to live for you. The only problem with that is what I've shared before from Oswald Chambers. He says the only problem with living sacrifices is they have a tendency to crawl off the altar. And I wonder for how many of us, man, that's what's happened. Maybe at some point in our life, we submitted our life, we surrendered our life to Christ, but we crawled off the altar. But he goes on to say, don't conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Then we'll be able to tell what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And for some of us, if you're like me, man, I look back at my teenage years, especially my early teenage years, and I compromised so much. I felt like I was living a double lifestyle because I'd live one way in front of my parents, my family, and certain friends that went to church, and I'd live another way with other friends because I wanted so much to have their approval. And looking back, so embarrassed and ashamed again of how I lived. But let's be honest, I wonder how many of us, that's what we're doing now. We compromise because so much we want acceptance. Maybe we're in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, or even 60s, and we're still compromising. We so much want to meet the expectations of others that we're setting aside the call of God in our lives. I want to encourage you guys today to do what God calls us to do what I have a challenge of doing, to lay my life out as a living sacrifice for him, not crawl off the altar because of others' expectations, what we think the world wants of us, but to hold tight to what God calls us to. Don't conform. And then we get to experience God teaching us his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So honored you spend time with me. Have an amazing day. As always, let's live reckless for the one who loves us most, Jesus. Bye, y'all.